the reason for this gathering here is Sinfree Makoni, who is here to my left, who is a professor at Penn State University, and who is also the director of African Studies there. And for the past 2 years, he has set in place a weekly, almost weekly forum called the Global Forum on Southern Epistemology. It has a longer title, but this is what it goes by now. And it has been very successful. You know, when he started, I don't think he imagined that it would be mushrooming to the extent that it has, and people from all over the world that have either given presentations or come just to attend. And 2 hours earlier today, this afternoon, we were just at one of the sessions of that forum. And so people ask all sorts of questions about the decoloniality, colonialism, coloniality, and so forth. And we want to be able to address these questions. And here to help me talk with Makoni, we also have Cécile Vigouroux from Fraser University. She teaches the sociolinguistics of French and ethnography and other things. And she is this year a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Paris. And myself, I'm Salikoko Mufwene, professor at the University of Chicago. And for this academic year, I'm the academic director of the University of Chicago Center here in Paris. So that's it. So Makoni, as you prefer to go by instead of Sinfree.
The questions can be asked in the chat.
Huh?
The question,
yes.
The rules of engagement, can you?
Okay, yeah, I'm reminded of the rules of engagement here. Yeah, I will start by asking a number of questions that are supposed to generate more discussion. And at any time, somebody here in the audience can raise their hand to ask a question, to elaborate or to clarify some of the things that Makoni says, or any one of us here may say. And people that are attended virtually, please write your questions in the Q&A section or in chat, and we will read your question and then engage with you. And that's how it's going to be. We don't want to wait until, for instance, the end of a lecture and then people can ask questions. It wouldn't work well in this format. And this conversation, as we have titled it, is rather informal. So the first question I would like to ask you, Makoni, does decolonizing knowledge construction mean that scholars from Africa or the global South in general are seeking independence from the global North in the production of knowledge?
Yes and no. Let me start off with the yes. I think the intention is to be in a position where the scholars from the global South and Africa, let's put aside for the time being what the global South is, to be in a position to be at least produce knowledge that is relevant to the African context. They want to have a say in the production of knowledge that is relevant to Africa. I think it was Cécile who said one time that it's only in Africa where the majority of knowledge, formal knowledge about Africa, is produced from outside. So the issue here is that Africa needs to have a say in determining what is relevant to itself. Having said that, that does not mean that this excludes other people from different geographical regions, philosophies, from contributing towards knowledge about Africa. But at the moment, it appears we play second fiddle in the production of framing of knowledge about Africa, and that is what we are seeking toward. That is what we are seeking to change. The long-term objective, there are two main long-term objectives. Africa to produce important information and knowledge about Africa. Secondly, Africa to produce knowledge about Africa that is relevant to the global north. In other words, the knowledge produced about Africa, if it is relevant to Africa, will resonate with knowledge that the global north requires. In other words, the blind spots of the global north are likely to be more illuminated if Africa is able to produce knowledge about itself.
Okay. So in a way, I can say this is supposed to be better than Africa's political independence.
Yes, that as long as Africa is not intellectually independent, that is not to the benefit of the global north as well. Right. So what I'm saying is this: if we are, as African scholars, able to operate as efficiently as we can to address issues that are of concern to us, this will have ramifications globally. Right.
Okay.
Right. That it is not to the benefit of anybody, of everybody globally, if Africa is underproducing its own knowledge.
Okay. What about people that may say, listen, it's easy for you, Makoni. You work at a North American university, you are well established. And are you going to set your own norms that scholars in Africa must follow? And if it is that way, what's the difference? Okay, the difference is that I am geographically located in North America, but all my work to date has been on Africa. It is not focused on North America at all, because I know very little about North America. North America is the geographical context within which I operate. But philosophically and politically, my engagement is with Africa. That is where my gaze is. Okay. And then the issue that is there is that I have set up my career in such a way that at the moment, even though I'm in North America, I have 3 or 4 different appointments with other universities in Southern Africa. So the strategic move there is I'm able to use North American resources to facilitate a wider engagement with more institutions in Southern Africa or Africa. Okay.
So how do you make this this knowledge relevant or make scholars from other ecologies make them aware of the relevance of this knowledge that it produced on Africa, in Africa, to address their own research questions that may have nothing to do with Africa?
Yes. The issue that is there, I think, I thought you were going to ask, how do I make my knowledge about Africa relevant to Africa, but that's not what you meant. What I mean is this. Let me give you a concrete example. The interest, for example, in North America or globally or even in Europe on multilingualism, etc., which to some extent is driven by the insights and experiences from Southern Africa. That the global community always reads something about Africa. And once it reads something about Africa, in some cases, that's when they are able to reflect on their own situation, right? In other words, we need to be more productive, not only for ourselves, but for the globe as well. Right?
What do you mean we need to be more productive?
What I mean is this, is that there are certain issues and insights that we are able to develop by being part of the African ecological system of knowledge production, which helps other people in different parts of the world.
That means actually not simply being productive, but also being proactive.
Proactive, yes.
Okay,
yes.
So being able to articulate research questions that Africans may be in a better position to articulate, but people from outside Africa wouldn't be able to do.
Yes, let me give you a good example. A concrete example would be the COVID cases, for example. That the initial predictions gave the impression that because of Africa's weak health systems, it was just going to be a complete catastrophe, right? But what those predictions overlooked was the experience Africa had gained from previous pandemics, right? So we developed what you can call the grammars of pandemics, of how to handle pandemics. And we handled that slightly better than, let's say, the United States. Yeah. In other words, the point I'm making is there are certain experiences that we have learned, which if we are able, for example, in the area of public health, are able to articulate those experiences, they will be able to benefit other parts of the globe.
Okay. And we can also say people shouldn't be fearing a provincialization of Africa as a cognitive world.
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
yes, yes.
But it's more for the inclusion of Africans in the construction of knowledge about Africa.
Yes, yes. But it's more about the Africa being included in how it constructs its knowledge about Africa. But the underlying argument in this is that if the knowledge is constructed about Africa, it is likely to have implications on how other knowledges for other places are constructed. If you carry out a study on knowledge, language practices in Johannesburg, in Harare, in Senegal, etc., the site may be Africa, but the insights are likely to be relevant to Paris, New York, etc. That is how these things work.
And one way you were articulating it at some point in a previous conversation was about looking at the structure, for example, of European languages from an understanding of the structures of African languages and actually challenge the work that has been done on the description of European languages, you know, taking other kinds of categories, other kind of structures as the starting point of the reflection of the description of European languages. Is it something that...
that is something that means, for example, the general tendency is to look, let's say, at African languages using European categories. But you could reverse the whole process and say, what are the categories that African scholars think they find in African languages? And if we use those categories to understand European languages, what images, what ideas about African languages, no, sorry, about European languages begin to emerge, right? So you then are taking the discussions about language varieties in an epistemological direction, right?
Okay, that actually suggests that we have to look into the categories that have been brought from the West to analyze African languages. see which categories must be kept.
Which categories must be kept
And which
categories
do we
dispense with? Yes, yes. And then once we've got that far, we then can say which of these various categories can we use to think and talk about European languages. Okay. In other words, we will be talking about another phase in the description of European languages, which is predicated on the description of African languages. That is the linguistic that is interesting to do.
Okay. Since linguistics was invented in the West in the 19th century, yes, coinciding with the colonization of the exploitation colonization of Africa and Asia, because the Americas had already been colonized by then.
Yes.
So in this case, the message that people should be taking from this is that decolonizing knowledge is not just about Africa.
No, no, no.
It can also be about Asia.
It can also be about Asia. It can also be about Europe. I mean, for example, the key argument that I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o makes, which is important, is that colonization affected all of us. The most important thing is to know but the difference is that it may have affected us in different ways, but it impacted all of us. Right. So there is no group of people internationally who are above the historical forces of colonization. Right. So you need, however, to know, given your own locality, how it played itself out and in what form it currently impacts you. And that is the issue that differs across different geopolitical spaces.
Okay.
And I think I agree with you that colonialism and coloniality have affected all of us. But I think why some people think that it's very removed from their own experience is because what is at stake for people living in certain parts of the world are very different than, for example, what may be at stake for people located in what's called the the global north and the kind of segment of the population they belong to or they associate with. And I think that's, when we talk about decoloniality of knowledge, we also need to address what is at stake. And what is at stake is it's more than an intellectual thing. It's really a deeply political project that has very concrete consequences for people.
Yes, yes. So it's like this. The decolonization is not only an epistemological thing. It affects institutions, it affects political arrangements, it affects curriculum, etc. And that decolonization means a number of other processes have to be set in motion simultaneously, right? And it's not only one aspect, it's a question of coming up with different arrangements about let's say, institutions, coming up with different arrangements about how, let's say, promotion, tenure, etc., are all handled within institutions. It requires a fundamental rethinking of what we are trying to do. And for me, what decolonization ultimately forces me to do is to rethink what it means to be a human scholar. That's where it becomes important for me. That's where it hits home, right? That I can't argue for this and still not change the way I relate to myself and to other scholars, right? And it's also the other important thing about decoloniality and all this, it's not a part-time exercise that you engage in on Monday to Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday you continue doing what you want to do, etc. It's a complete overhaul in what you are doing, right? So you can't come up and say methodologically it was a decolonial thing, but I only analyzed and wrote the results in a different way.
So one of the critiques that that had been addressed to post-colonial thinkers was that their project was an elitist project. And do you think that some people may argue that regarding the decolonial or decolonization of knowledge? What would you respond to people who would say, well, you know, it's just about an elitist thing, that people engage in academia and people who want to secure positions in academia, they want to do that but by moving the center? What would you respond to people like that? Because I'm sure you have heard this kind of critique.
It depends. I mean, for me, it's decoloniality, for it to be effective, would require the elites to work in collaboration with other different groups in the world, in the societies that they are part of. An idea of an elite group working on decoloniality on its own is in actual fact inadequate. They need to enter into alliances with other different. That is where, for example, the work by Catherine Walsh, Bonaventura dos Santos, where they work both within and outside the university in terms of those alliances. Alliances is the key word for such particular issue. And once you enter into alliances, the nature and type of knowledge that you're going to be generating in this decolonial exercise becomes different. Because typically what tends to happen in university institutions is you concentrate on the knowledge of those who are victorious. You don't concentrate on the knowledge of those that may have failed who may have been failed by the system. You don't concentrate on those who are struggling in the system. So when the elites are working in collaboration with other people, you will need knowledge before the struggle, knowledge during the struggle, and knowledge even after failure.
So there are 3 questions online that I want to convey to you. So Kathleen is asking, why should the reference point still be the global north? Shouldn't Africans producing knowledge that is relevant to Africa be the issue? And I think you touch upon.
Yeah, I said that I didn't say the reference point will be the north. I said that the knowledge that is going to be relevant about Africa to the global north is going to be relevant to Africa as well. It is difficult to see, to think of knowledge about Africa that is only relevant to the north. It needs somehow to be relevant to Africa, and it will then have ramifications over and abroad, ramifications elsewhere.
Yeah, I think there is another reason why the global north remains a point of reference, because Makoni and I and a number of other African linguists have been trained in the north. Yeah. And we have been trained in a paradigm, research paradigm that has been defined by the north. So in a way, I think it is a message to ourselves as African scholars in terms of emancipating ourselves from the constraints of that particular paradigm. The other thing is that even in Africa, the people trained in the north have gone to Africa and they have spread the same paradigm that they learned.
Yes.
And when there is, for instance, somebody in Africa that comes up with an alternative analysis, it's too easy to dismiss that because they haven't received the same kind of training. So the people that would be practicing colonial knowledge of the colonial knowledge construction are not necessarily Westerners. They could be people indigenous to Africa that just need to emancipate themselves from that kind of trust.
Yes. I want to a Carnegie Fellowship, and I went to one African country, which shall remain nameless, but I think my colleagues will be able to identify it. What really surprised me at that point was the extent to which all the references they were using were not references about their own work. Right. These were, people that had PhDs in applied linguistics, etc., and with a lot of that material, but they were never referring to their own work. They were only referring to the work from outside, their supervisors, etc., etc. So I then argued that, look here, I won't talk to you guys anymore unless you come up with a new syllabus that includes what you have published, where your PhDs are, because that gives your students a certain level of confidence that you can cite Cécile, you can cite Makoni, you can cite Salikoko in your own syllabus. But that's not what they were doing. Right. And the problem there was not structural, it was ideological. Lack of confidence in what they themselves had produced. Right. And then you can imagine how that situation is construed by the students. They so-and-so, Dr. So-and-so has come back and there's a PhD, but they look at all the references, but there's nothing that is there from that particular person. Yeah.
So Michael is asking a question, but because there is a delay between the question and the reading of the question, so I don't exactly know what he's referring to, but Michael, if you want to specify what you mean by that, but okay, I offer the question to you guys. Is it the case that you want to have your cake and eat it too?
No, I don't need to eat anything now. There are easier ways of running my career now than this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. I don't need to do this.
Okay.
I'm not doing it for somebody else, for being a Samaritan or etc. But I don't need to agonize about this. They are going to use at a space term. There are safer and easier ways in which I could go about my career, but I can't because ideologically the issues at stake are too important to be left. Yeah.
So Kathleen is asking, inclusion of knowledge from Africa has been mentioned. Inclusion is a loaded word, as it implies that there are those who have the power to include, and there are those whose inclusion is to be decided upon. Don't you think that the concept of inclusion is rooted in coloniality?
Okay, you could talk about if inclusion carries those it's ideologically loaded for you. You could talk about creating ecologies of knowledge which are pertinent to Africa and global, if that perhaps may be a better way for you. Or you could talk about embedding African knowledges or whatever you want to talk about. If inclusion is too loaded a term for you.
I use the term inclusion, and in the current political context of American universities, you can interpret it in a number of ways. Inclusion, like making room for people that don't belong with you to become part of the group. That's inclusion. But there's inclusion with conditions. You are included to the extent that you want to work by my rules. But you are not included if you come and ask me to re-examine the rules of engagement in the new group. So there's a kind of inclusion that is assimilationist, that is really not open to outside influence. But there's inclusion that is more accepting of a dialogue between the newcomer and the people that have always belonged there. So,
to extend what Cécile is talking about, is that inclusion means you are rewriting the terms and conditions on which you engage with each other, which is different from saying you are included, but you are included on my own terms.
Yeah, and I think Kathleen's question touches upon the logic that apply in the scientific field, okay, in general, because it's a locus of competition, of monopolies, of power dynamics, you know, position takings, and basically the name of the game seems to be that each person involved in what Bourdieu would call the game is trying to secure his or her position within the field. And of course, what it means is that when you try to secure your position of power within the field, you actually try to, you know, refrain people, other people with other ideas, people coming from other, you know, spaces, other framing, have other intellectual framing. You behave like a gatekeeper. I'm not saying you guys. I'm saying people behave like gatekeepers. You know, because basically you have academic reputations that have been built on certain ways of doing things, on certain ways of tackling research questions, on certain methodologies. And suddenly there are other people say, wait a minute, that may apply to your specific work, but, you know, I want to offer other ways of looking, even your own, you know, research, your own research question. So I think Kathleen's question is about when she say who decides upon, you know, who must be included. I think it really tackles the logics of the academic field.
Yeah, the academic field functions in different ways. What we have described is one way it could function, but that need not necessarily be the only way it could function.
I agree.
Right. So the question that is there is to ask ourselves, is this the most desirable way in which we can function? The model that you have talked about, cited here, is the model of the individual lone scholar working in the library and getting on with their work. There are other more collaborative, collegial ways in which you can work. And for me, at the moment, it is the latter that I think I find much more encouraging than the idea of the single scholar working on their own, not talking to anybody because they are afraid that they will compete. They will have somebody that will compete with them. I've said, for example, to my other junior colleagues and PhD students that they must compete, but there must be only one person that they compete with, and that is themselves. Right? You should compete with yourself. Are you doing better now than you were doing in the past? Right? If you say you're going to compete with Cécile, it doesn't help you because you don't know how Cécile functions. Right? So what you can do is to enter into a dialogue, work with Cécile's expertise so that can help you move forward. And that will be consistent with African philosophical views about how we collaborate in all different types of things. Rarely do you find in African context situations in which, for example, if they're going to the farm and they're working, do they work on their own? You work with other people, right? You work with other people, not because the whole thing is collective. It is by working with other people that you are able to realize your own individual uniqueness. Right? You don't realize your individual uniqueness by being outside your group, but by being part of the group.
And I think knowing your work and knowing the way you function, what I find interesting is you put that into practice. Okay, it's not just about discourse, we should all work together, we are not in competition with each other. Actually, in what you do with the Global Forum, in the text you publish, the kind of intertextual, conversations, the voices you make visible in the production of text, of academic text, show that actually this is indeed possible.
That is indeed possible, and it is desirable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, but there's an issue that must be addressed in Kathleen's question. Yeah. Because it points to hegemony. is there some sort of Western hegemony in the way that academic knowledge has been developed, especially about Africa?
Or in general?
Okay, or in general, because if science, it's not that the people that are doing this are intentionally claiming some hegemony, is that things have evolved in such a way that some people are in a more powerful position than some other people. The books are published in the West, okay? The best institutions, academic institutions, we are not going to deny it, in the West. There are now many emerging in Asia, you know, but Asia too continues to compare itself to the West. They don't, from my point of view, I've been on one of those committees evaluating how well the programs are doing. And at some point I asked, why do you always have to compare things to the West? Because you have alternative ways. And when I look at Asia, I look at the technology that has been developed there. It's really impressive. And in many cases, Asia is ahead of the West. But when it comes to academia, people are still wondering whether, you know, they are comparable to the West. In Africa, it's worse because Africa is economically poor. And they cannot really, they haven't been able to invest as much money into research, into the solid infrastructure for building solid academia. So I think this is a message, that's the way I interpret it, that should also go to African politicians, you know. What are you doing with all the raw materials and the money that you are making from the raw materials? Why isn't more money invested in the academia? And why isn't there more funding coming from Africa? Why should Africa be waiting for funding from the West? Because these are all prerequisites for solid, for solid academia and for giving people more incentives to think independent of the West and say, okay, we receive funding from Africa, we have to address needs of Africa first. We can think universal, but it's Africa first, and things like that.
I need to be very careful how I frame this. So you should listen carefully because there's a bit of tongue-in-cheek in what I'm saying. I think universities in the global north have a very high degree of wastage. And then you can ask me what I mean. Let me sort of give you hypothetical examples which are not really true. If, for example, the University of Zimbabwe has a budget of $100 and they produce 4 articles, and Penn State University has a budget of $5 million and they produce 200 articles, which of those 2 universities is functioning more effectively? The one with $100 producing 4, or the one with $6 million producing 100? In other words, what I'm saying is this, is that there is within the African university room for potential creativity and growth, even if the amount of money that is given is limited. But within the Western universities, I think the system doesn't function as effectively as it ought to. Right. That is completely different. Because if I just look at the little money that is given to those African universities and what they produce, and I compare in terms of the budget, what the Western universities produce, and the number of articles, that the amount of money they have and the articles that they produce, then the African universities are not doing too badly at all. Then the second thing that is there is that if the African universities were doing that badly, you wouldn't have people like Salikoko here. Right. And all those African students who come in after their first degrees who are able to cope and survive. So there must be something about those African universities that they are able to do and do well. And that is what we need to be able to cultivate and grow, rather than, I think, dismiss them collectively.
Yeah, and I want to challenge your premise, Sally, is that you seem to abide by the criteria that have been set to assess success. What is good scholarship? And I think part of decoloniality is also about to challenge, what makes good scholarship, what is a productive scholar. And we all know that the rankings of these universities in the world are highly problematic, and I think that needs to be challenged and not say, well, I mean, because if you don't challenge this criteria, again, you don't unsettle you will take as an example the global north in the ways in which knowledge should be produced, in the ways in which productivity should be assessed, in the ways in which quality is assessed, and I find all this very problematic.
But as you know, I'm also an iconoclast.
No, I know.
In a sense that I'm a troublemaker. I question a lot of things in the fields of linguistics where I practice scholarship. The thing is, okay, we go back here to the question of not as a point of reference.
Yeah, but they are very interesting questions.
Yeah, but there are times when we also have to question what is going on in the South, and it doesn't depend.
No, sure.
It doesn't depend only on academics. It depends on people that should support academia. Okay.
So Susan is asking several questions about language. So she said, do you believe that decolonizing African literature should essentially begin with African languages, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o's encourages the young generation of African writers to do? Also, in support of Kathleen's ideas of inclusion as a loaded word, would that count for the lack of recognition of a prolific writer such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has continued writing in his native language, Kikuyu, as a basis before having these works translated into European languages? Actually, just as a side note, Ngugi translates his own work into English. He doesn't have a translator. He writes in Kikuyu and then he translates. So the ways in which he explains he writes two books, basically. But can you address the issue of language and African languages as part of the decoloniality project? She talks about literature, but I guess it applies to other forms of producing knowledge.
That's one of my favorite questions. One of them is, why does Ngugi have to translate his book from Kikuyu to a European language? Well, and he has a very good reason for that, whether or not he admits it. He needs to make money. And right now, literacy in an African language is not making money. Why isn't literature in an African language not making money? We go again to the political and economic infrastructure. If a parent has to decide whether to spend their shilling on buying a book or buying food, what is the most practical decision to make? And we produce literacy, we want to produce literacy in African languages, which is actually very noble, and I love it. But in order for that to succeed, we need an infrastructure that helps. In other words, don't start by saying, let's teach the language in elementary school while the university is operating in English and French. start with the university in an African language and let things trickle down. And that is not happening. And this is part of that endeavor about, decolonizing things. And we should have government that operate entirely in African languages. We should have economic systems, especially the strata of the economic system that pay the best money to operate in indigenous languages. So in Africa, we have this fear of being isolated because if we operate in African languages, we think we are going to be isolated from the rest of the world. If we do well, the world will learn African languages. Look at what has happened in China. Operating in Chinese, now an American businessman that wants to do business with China must learn Chinese. Unfortunately, for every 100 Americans learning Chinese, there are 1,000 Chinese learning English because they want to sell to America. So these are the kinds of things that we have to engage with too. We need global solutions to global problems.
Yeah, Ngugi is an interesting personality because I think what is interesting about him, whether his arguments about Kikuyu and English are correct or not, is beside the point. What is interesting is he has stuck to that particular position throughout his lifetime about Kikuyu and English. But when you read his analytical treatise, it's not only writing in Kikuyu, then translating into English. He uses a term that is very interesting. He talks about that all languages are based on some form of musicality, and each language contributes towards this musicality like an orchestra. So even though he is arguing for Kikuyu, he is also at the same time arguing for the importance of all the different languages, right? And that's what he captures by the notion of orchestra and musicality. But that tends to be overlooked as we get stuck on his notion of Kikuyu. And then the other interesting thing about Ngugi is when you read the comments that he makes about the challenges of translating his own work, you get the impression linguistically that what Ngugi is in actual fact doing there, he is involved in a one-person language standardization project, right? Because he tells you, oh, I couldn't find words for this, I had to create these words, etc., and all that. And that is another dimension to his work, which is worth looking at. And then the third part about Ngugi that is interesting is the connection he makes between language and memory. For him, it's important to keep the African languages because if you don't use them, then there's a lot about particular areas and you will forget them. So he cites the use of, besides New York City, for example, that the name of New York City, before it was called New York City, there was a particular name that was used and that has been lost, etc. So they are very sophisticated arguments he has about what he understands by language and the politics of language, and to some extent, the social dynamics of language. Ngugi's views, I mean, Cécile, they're largely Wolffian in view. They're largely Wolffian in view that you have to keep this language because it shapes how you see the world. Yeah.
Is there any question from the
audience? Don't look so miserable now.
There is a question for you two. Talawa asked, how does each speaker define African? More specifically, does the notion of African include African people in the diaspora, for example, Caribbean, African American, etc.? It's a highly political question.
Okay, well, No, first of all, it starts with Africa, and everybody in the diaspora is part of Africa to some extent. And many of the issues that Africa is confronted with, people in the diaspora are confronted with the same, with similar questions. Take for instance, African American English. Okay, look at how things balance out. How many white scholars are there studying African American English? And how many African Americans are there studying white non-standard varieties of English? Okay. And the people that study African American English, what's the proportion of people now among African American scholars that are saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't think that this particular ethnolect has been investigated adequately regarding this and this property, Take Creoles, what's the proportion of white Americans or white Europeans that are studying Creoles, as opposed to people of African descent that are investigating Creoles. What happens with the person when the person of African descent says, this is the way we should be analyzing this particular aspect of that feature of a Creole? How much resistance do they face? So, but I give this example because I think Creoles is probably, the Creole languages are the domain where I think there has been the most constructive dialogue between the received doctrine and innovative ideas, because there are more and more people of African descent that have become very vocal in rejecting old analysis about Creoles and so forth. The question is whether this is happening with other kinds of things,
To get back to the question of who is an African, I agree with Sally. I mean, for me, anybody who is either in Africa or who claims to have some form of African heritage is an African. And that's where I think I find Michael West's notion of global Africa relevant. Yes, there will be differences in emphasis culturally, etc. But that's generally the definition that I tend to gravitate towards.
So there is a question by LA, and sorry for mispronouncing your first name. So how far the notion of coloniality could be extended? Are they, as there is an argument for an African epistemology, can an argument be made for a Congo or Ghana or Kenya and so on epistemology? This is relevant when the colonial history tries not have the center of place, but inclusion is the central point. Within the North itself, the knowledge of the indigenous communities is constructed by people outside them. Do they have a part in the construction of knowledge of themselves?
That's a very, very good question. And indigenous people should have a louder voice in the construction of knowledge about indigenous languages. But then, we face another fundamental question. How many indigenous people have been trained to where they can challenge the current scholarship? In the 19th century, it was white Americans who went and described indigenous languages, and the purpose was quite clear: make indigenous languages the most peculiar possible so that you can declare that indigenous people are inferior and they cannot control the land. Let's take the land away from them and so forth. We know the consequences. So yes, that question is a very, very good one. How can we restructure things in such a way that Native Americans get the training not to replicate what white Americans have developed about as knowledge about their languages, but to be able to challenge the received doctrine too. We want to hear from them.
Yes, for example, in terms of Native Americans, I mean, anthropologists or linguists like Elaine Cushman, for example, who is an American indigenous scholar. It describes some of the indigenous languages that she speaks. Yeah, that's what you want, was ultimately the descriptions about language are social descriptions, and they need to have a certain level of social validity. And if the speakers of those languages don't buy into those descriptions, then you have a problem somehow. You have got a problem that you have to deal with. Right.
Yeah. And actually, I'll go even further than that. Let's take France, for instance. Okay. This is a well-developed country. It has its traditional academic system and so forth. But French scholars are asked to write grant proposals in English. Okay, and the examiners needing, the reviewers needn't be French, they should be international. That's a kind of coloniality, isn't it? It's cognitive coloniality. And, you know, I support French scholars that go against this kind of system.
But there is a part of Ele's question you haven't touched upon about so an argument for an African epistemology. Can an argument be made for Congo, Ghana, Kenya, and so on epistemology?
Yeah, but Ghana, Congo, and all that, those are notions of states.
Yes.
Right. That is the problem that is there. Yeah. So they are different from the idea of epistemologies. And as we know, the notion of a state is an extremely problematic one, because there are other people across different boundaries in Togo, Ghana, and all that. So the two don't match.
What I like about the question is that we Africans living abroad are contributing to reifying Africa as if it were this homogeneous continent. And so this is just one way of speaking. We can go, you know, to these smaller geographical divisions and say Congo. But you say Congo, there are 250 ethnic groups in the Congo. So I think the message here is that, like, people that go and do field work shouldn't just be a Westerner getting funding and hiring people to produce data or materials that will be articulated as data at some stage, but involving the natives, the local, in this kind of research, so that they can also hear interpretations of the locals about this, you know, what the locals, how the locals interpret this particular phenomena and so forth, and double check with the locals whether the analysis that have been produced are adequate enough and satisfactory to them.
For example, even if you were to bring epistemology and ethnicity together, check with the locals whether they think the rituals of funerals in this ethnic group are different from the rituals of funerals in another group there, right? Because they will know. You don't only know the rituals in your own ethnic group, but you will have some understanding about the rituals in other different groups. So that is what you need to be able to do. But bring on board the local intellectuals, the different ethnic groups, because they will be able to make a case for you to see where there are overlaps and where there are differences philosophically between their own positions and those of groups which are around them. The situation gets even more complicated and even more exciting, particularly in situations where there's cross-ethnic marriages, for example.
Yeah, and I think you pointed something very important when you talked about states and the question also point out that this imagination of Africa as constructed according to well-defined states is a very recent construction. And so, but it impacts in the ways in which, for example, I'm talking about the colonial varieties that are described. So French from Senegal, French from Mali, English from Kenya. Actually, it ratifies these colonial arbitrary, distinctions. And so just by, talking about varieties in this specific, state is highly problematic.
It is problematic because what is problematic is one, the process of reapplication of language, and then two, the process of the idea of a state that is there.
Exactly. And the naturalization of
these particular categories.
Of this particular category. So there is another question from Kathleen, say, interestingly, people from the continent of Africa are most often referred to as Africans, not as Congolese, South African, Nigerian, Senegalese. At the same time, people from the continent of Europe are most often referred to as German, British, French, Belgium. What is, in your view, of blurring national ethnic difference in Africa in this way? Do you define yourself in ethnic and national terms? Is it important to you?
No, it is not.
That's a perceptive question. Okay.
I don't define myself in ethnic terms. I define myself in terms of what I think I do. And the issue of my ethnic affiliation or something like that is very secondary to my own sense of how I understand my identity. That may be different in terms of how other people see me. But that's not, I don't define myself first and foremost as Shona, then those categories don't mean much to me.
Okay. It's also a matter of critical mass. So if in over 40 years in the United States, I have come across somebody of my ethnic background only twice or three times. So it's not in my interest to go by my ethnic identification. I go by regional identification. And very often we find ourselves in settings where he's from Zimbabwe, I'm from the Congo, and somebody else is from Ghana, and we are the only Africans in that setup, in that ecology. It's not in our interest to define ourselves nationally. And so, but if you take the immigrants from Europe, they come in larger numbers than Africans, although there is more focus now on people coming from the global south, immigrants from the global south rather than immigrants from the global north. So I think we are all caught in that.
We're all caught in that. And for me, what then is interesting is, even when I get into a situation where there's a critical mass of, let's say, Shona speakers, they always imagine that I'm going back anywhere. So the question is, the depth of my ethnic connection with the people who are there is very tenuous. They always ask, but when are you going back to where you come from? So you're more or less a permanent migrant in their eyes.
But I think the question touches upon the issue of positionality, okay? Because it's very much part of what is at stake as well in decoloniality is about situated knowledge, okay? And it seems to me that, some scholars, when they declare their positionality, is about a kind of how, I need to be very careful in the ways in which I say that. It's not a reflexive stance that should be, I mean, declaring one's positionality is not just about say, hey, I'm Makoni, I'm from Zimbabwe, and blah, blah, blah. I think the reflexive stance is far more than listing the places or the place where you come from. And I think there is a confusion. For example, I see this has become a trend in the papers I read. Yes, I'm working on Africa, but I need to acknowledge that I'm white and therefore blah, blah, blah. And I think it's not a reflexive stance, in declaring one's, one's racial categorization is not what reflexivity and situated knowledge should be. So I read the question of Kathleen as a question about positionality and how as well it constructs the knowledge of that we produce.
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that your positionality, to some extent, is captured for me in terms of the road that you have traveled, or the road that you will travel, that captures that particular aspect. But then the other aspects about positionality and what you finally do, the question to ask, in actual fact, is to what extent can positionality exhaust or provide an adequate explanation to everything that you are interested in? And my answer is that it cannot. There are certain things that you get interested in, and you can't attribute everything that you are interested in to your positionality, right? So it's a question of knowing, yes, I'm interested in this because of this, but there are other things that I'm interested in because I'm a professional linguist, I teach somewhere, etc. So, yeah.
And for me, I would say it's relative, depending on what is at issue.
Yes.
If we are talking, for instance, about the politics of development in Africa, I'm African. But also I have to remember that there is variation within Africa.
Yes.
And so in some cases, I have to be more specific. So I'm African when it's based on aerial features of Africa. But when it is a matter of more specific features, I'm Central African and not just African. And at some point, I'm going to say, I'm from the western part of the Congo. Yeah.
And you can't use your geographical affiliation to all those things to explain all your interest and expertise in Creole linguistics, for example. It can only go so far. Positionalities can only take you so far. Right. And they can't account for everything that you do.
Yeah. Just about a week ago, 3 scholars of African descent, including myself, were talking about nasalization. When a nasal consonant follows a vowel, do you nasalize the vowel or don't you? And in Haitian Creole, the vowel is nasalized. And the colleague wanted to know whether this comes from Africa. And I said, in my part of Africa, the nasal goes with the following consonant. It's not part of, it doesn't form a syllable with the preceding vowel. And then I said, but I have to be cautious. I don't know everything about Africa. And the other colleague is from Benin. And he said, well, in Benin, for Ewe speakers, we split into 2 groups, those that nasalize the vowel and those that don't.
Okay.
So these are the kind of things that we have to take into account. And so that's the danger of reifying Africa, one person speaking on the behalf of everybody, all Africa, when they don't know the whole Africa no more than, say, a European can know everything about European languages. It's expecting too much or claiming too much,
So there is a question by Susan about language, and there have been discussions in the chat about the linguistic diversity of the African continent. And Suzanne said the answer could come from the use of Swahili to unify Africa's knowledge production. Many African countries have adopted it as a second language in Anglophone, although Nigeria might argue that Igbo or Yoruba are widely spoken and need recognition. I think the problem is this attempt to unify. Is it not about the decolonial project? Is not about, trying to produce a homogeneous, unifying, thing. I think it's antithetical with the decolonial project. What do you think?
Yeah, that's trying to solve a colonial problem with a colonial solution. So why should everything work on the model of the West? And you look at the West, it's not so uniform. Look at Switzerland. Look at Belgium.
I agree with you.
So Africa doesn't need one lingua franca for the whole of Africa.
No.
We need regional lingua francas. There is no reason why we should look for a kind of African-wide lingua franca that everybody should use. And Africa can be united with a multitude of languages. And when you look at conflicts in Africa, a lot of these conflicts are also occurring in polities that are technically
very homogeneous. Yes. So Somalia is an excellent example. They all understand. You could argue, the more they understand each other, the more they fight.
Very often, language is an epiphenomenon for different kinds of problems.
So
yes.
Can you come closer here so that the other people can hear you, please?
The mic is here.
Yeah.
So just
speak loud enough.
It seems to me from the beginning that the question that we are asking is about access. So to academia and to publishing and everything. And even when we talk about training or having a say in description of languages, it's always about how are we gonna access like the academia field. And so we can talk a lot about making a different production of knowledge or making a different academia field. But even to be able to ask these questions and for them to be heard, we need to secure a position in an academic field that works, as you say, as a gatekeeper economically and socially. So as much as I like talking about these questions, my fear is that it's not heard because it doesn't want to be heard, right? So how do you like give a solution for this access problem?
You're running away now. I think you're right. What we're trying to do is to encourage people to ask the hard questions. Because it is only by asking the hard questions that we will be able to make progress on some of these issues. And the way I think about these things at the moment is that I think it is not completely accurate to say we will find solutions to these issues. Politically, the situations in Africa are so dynamic that we will find viable alternatives that work for some time. And then we have to revisit the issue again. There are no permanent solutions to these issues. Otherwise, our predecessors would have found them. Right? But there are viable alternatives that we can play around with. Let's say how we can enhance access for some time, and then we discover that we need to rethink these particular issues. That's the way I tend to think about it. Because if I think about solutions, then we are going to be disillusioned when we don't solve the problem. But if I think about viable alternatives, that gives me a sense of temporality, time when this thing is working. But I know that the time will come when the forces and the configuration of forces are such that we need to reimagine what the challenges are.
And I think, do you want to say something?
Go ahead.
No, I think it's a very important question, and I think you ask this question from your position as a young scholar, I guess. And I think there are many like-minded people. You need to find like-minded people, and that's why you know what Makoni has shown is that it's not about a personal endeavor, it's a collective enterprise. So you need to find like-minded people, you know, and also people like us who want to do things differently. We need to invest what is it called, the loci where knowledge is produced. For example, being on editorial boards of journals, being on as reviewers. I mean, each of us has a part to play. Academia doesn't exist outside us, you know? So, and we shouldn't think that academia is the structure and either we enter or we remain at the margin. Academia is what we make out of it.
This is academia.
It's very important to remember that.
Right.
And you, as an individual, like each of us as individuals, each of us has no power. We only have power collectively. So, and that's why we all need to enter into a conversation with each other. This is very important. It's not an individual enterprise.
And the good thing now about with all Zoom and all things like that is that you can get hold of Sally and Cécile to talk about even your PhD and have a chat with them, etc. Much easier now than would have been the case in our own generation. Right. So you don't have to be completely dependent on what your advisor and supervisor says, because now you have got access to a wider range of people. And I may have my own quarrels with the academy, but they are with academia, but there are a lot of very generous people who are very generous with the amount of time that they are likely to spend on you. Right.
I was going to say something articulated differently. It's like social movements. Take feminists, for instance. It worked in part because there were men that understood the claims that women have been making. Racist, same kind of thing. You know, we can abolish racism in part because there are people that are, privileged and racially privileged that are sensitive to voices for change. And we work together. And I don't want to give the impression that we think that all Western scholars operate in the colonial framework. There are a lot of Western scholars that are advocates of decoloniality and would like to work with people from the global South that can help change things. But there's another side of it. Although you suggested, operating in the Northern academic framework and so forth and using those standards, it's not really that. It's that you must make sure that you articulate your point clearly. You must make sure that you have evidence to support your case. It's not enough to say, I'm African, therefore I'm an authority of this African language, and this is what I say.
But if you do that, then there is no argument you're ever going to have. Because Sally will say, this is the case because I'm African. I will also come and say, this is the case because I'm African. Then there's no way you can resolve that dispute. Right. In other words, the key thing, that's my argument.
Yeah.
If you are going to make a case for African scholarship because you are African, then the demands for intellectual clarity must be much higher on you. So that it's not simply a question of saying, oh, it's true because he has said so, he is African, right? You must be able to put up a stronger argument, marshal the evidence, so that people can see where this is taking us.
So Talawa is, and Kathleen are coming back to the notion of, to the issue of positionality. Positionality does not explain everything you are interested in, but does it not determine the way you see and interpret things? And Talawa say, isn't positionality more about the researcher being honest on the limitation of their analysis and the social context of their perspective, be it on racial level, white, black, or an ethnic, internally speaking, etc.?
Positionality does not determine what you are interested in, but it may account for your orientation to a problem. Right. That's what I can say. Right.
Yeah. I mean, scholarship is a humbling endeavor.
Yes.
So one must always be prepared to be proved wrong.
Yeah.
But one must also be prepared to know when they are right and when they have to keep fighting.
Yes, yes.
And the difficult question is, how do you tell one from the other?
No.
Well,
and once you've got, I mean, for whatever reasons, I mean, we all get interested in things for very many different reasons. Once you've got interested in whatever you're doing, it's not likely that your positionality will determine all the various types of books that you're going to read. No. No, or how you're going to relate to those books, not at all. Scholarship is a journey that is unpredictable. Where it will take you, you never know. Who you will meet to talk to and about is very, very unclear. Yeah. Because, for example, anybody who is doing a PhD now, the only thing that your supervisor can say to you at the very beginning is what you are saying now and what you will say 3-4 years down the road are very different. Because you change as you go along. You change.
Okay, I think.
You want to say something?
Oh, sorry.
So you are both based in North America. You were trained there, if I'm not wrong. I would like to know what is your action in Africa, or maybe in Zimbabwe or in Congo, whatever, or in other countries from Africa. How do you concretely work with African scholars? So what is your action in Africa?
Okay. I have 4 different appointments in Africa at the moment. I supervise PhD students in different universities in Africa. I have more students that I work with from Africa than those who are in North America, right? Okay. And I spend a lot of my time reading dissertations and working through with people in North America. And in the global forum that I work on, there are a number of other people who I supervise who are part of that. So I engage in that. And then there's the young lady who runs the Department of English at the University of Zimbabwe, put it neatly to me when she was asking me to supervise. She simply said, it doesn't matter how far you rise, I can always instruct you to do what I want because you are Zimbabwean in my eyes. Right. That was according to her. She didn't need to ask me whether I had time to do that. So, and also, it's not simply because I'm doing it because I am a kind person. I also get to know more about what happens in a region that I'm fundamentally interested in. And at the moment, I do quite a lot of work in Kenya through the Carnegie Foundation, etc., and all that, at Laikipia University. So where we are trying to set up PhD programs and I supervise students there. So yes, it's some, I have more students there in Africa than I have in North Africa.
Sorry, You do this remotely or you go there?
It's a combination of the last 2 years, it was remotely, but in most cases I go there. For example, in June, July, I was at Nelson Mandela University, then I was the University of South Africa, then I went to University of Zululand, etc. And in November, I'll be at the University of Zululand again.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, we are running out of time.
Should I answer a question?
Oh, excuse me. Sorry, Sally. I'm sorry.
Some of my most subversive positions have been articulated before African audiences. And I think 2 years ago, I went to teach in a summer school.
Oh, that's my
Paid my own tickets, received no compensation. All I needed was a room where I can sleep and a place where I can eat.
Yeah, that's true.
And that was it. And I have talked to African scholars saying, you know, if you make arrangements for me to come, I'll come. But that is where I go back to economics and politics. You know, somebody has to tell me, listen, we have the infrastructure for you to operate. Come and we'll work together. Not me going there to teach them, but me collaborating with them so that we can do something together. And it's too easy to say my colleagues in Africa are not really thinking much of me. They do, but they need the money, and the money shouldn't be coming out of their pockets, and they are not paid well enough to do anything. And so we need things to change fundamentally in Africa so that there can be more collaboration between us and our colleagues who are still in Africa. Now with Zoom and so forth, we can organize meetings.
We can organize that.
Yes.
For example, there are classes that I teach in Africa where the students, it's a combination of students from Africa and students at Penn State. Because of Zoom, I just combined the groups and then it all. And then in July next year, I mean, Cécile and Sally will be part of this summer school that we are setting up, where we are inviting students to come, and we do the best that we can.
And it's embarrassing because, you know, I've been several times to Brazil. People invite me. They don't pay me an honorarium. They say, we don't have enough money, but we'll pay for your air ticket and we'll pay for your room and board expenses. And I go and stay there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And I'll be going back in March to Brazil. But, you know, when I look back to my home country, I've been making arrangements for the past 5 years and nothing has materialized.
It's true. It's true.
So thank you very much to all of you online and to you in the audience in Presentia. Yes, there will be a recording. It has been recorded, and I guess it will be made available to all of us.
Yeah, what a shame we had more questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.